Have you ever thought about what it would be like to survive winter without central heating, electricity, or even socks? Imagine being stuck in a snow-covered shack with nothing but smoke, straw, and superstition to keep you alive. Because that's exactly what people in the Middle Ages had to deal with. And somehow, against all odds, they didn't freeze to death. While we complain about a broken boiler, medieval folk had to get creative. With no thermostats or double glazing, they came up with some wild ways to beat the cold. Staying warm wasn't optional, it was survival. In the tiny villages of 14th century Europe, peasant homes were cobbled together using whatever could be scavenged, mostly wood, mud, and bundles of dried grass. The design was basic, but every element had a purpose. Thick bundles of straw or reeds layered onto thatched roofs helped hold in whatever heat they could muster. Not luxurious, but it beat freezing to death. In the bigger stone buildings, the castles and fortified manors, the situation wasn't much better. Giant stone walls were great for defense, but terrible at keeping out the cold. Heating a medieval castle was like trying to warm up a fridge from the inside. So they got crafty. Massive tapestries weren't just for showing off. They were used to stop the wind from howling through the cracks in the stone. In peasant homes, the hearth was everything. It cooked your food, lit your room, and stopped your toes from snapping off. For the wealthy, things weren't exactly cozy either. They added metal braziers, basically portable campfires, and fancy bolstow supplement their hearths. Still, even with all that effort, most rooms were as cold as a politician's smile. Windows? Barely existed. Most peasant homes skipped them entirely. If there were any, they didn't have glass-just wooden shutters to keep out the wind. The fancier folks might have had tiny panes of handmade glass in select areas, but only if they were truly rolling in silver. Inside castles, giant wooden tables and solid benches made up the furniture. The lord's private rooms might include a canopy bed, storage chests, and actual chairs, which made them royalty by medieval standards. But despite the difference in wealth, everyone had to fight the same brutal enemy, winter. And the cold wasn't even the worst part. Because what really threatened their lives wasn't the freezing wind, it was hunger. To make it through the long, dark season, people had to plan months in advance. By autumn, everything had to be ready. Miss the window, and you didn't just go hungry, you didn't make it at all. Harvests had to be perfectly timed. Crops needed to be picked, preserved, and stored before the first frost hit. Every single household, from dirt-poor farmers to high-born nobles, lived according to the seasons. As the final leaves fell, the panic to stockpile food began. Peasants survived on what would now be called prison rations: dried beans, root vegetables, salted fish, and rough bread baked from barley or rye. Big batches of bread were baked in communal ovens, because most homes didn't even have a proper place to cook. Storage was a luxury, so preservation was everything. Every bit of food had to last for months, and while nobles might have had pantries instead of pits, they still had to plan carefully. Even inside stone castles, a harsh winter didn't care about your title. Even the rich had to stock up like squirrels. Their cellars and storerooms were crammed with everything from sacks of grain and barrels of pickled vegetables to smoked fish and half-mummified deer legs. But don't be fooled, having money didn't guarantee an easy winter. When the snow piled up and carts stopped rolling, even wealthy households could run low on supplies. In fact, if a noble banquet ran short on food, it wasn't just awkward, it was politically embarrassing. These feasts weren't just about stuffing faces, they were flexes. Huge winter banquets were designed to shout, "We've got food, power, and a pig on a platter." So how did they make the food last without refrigerators? It was all about old-school survival skills. They salted meat until it could survive a siege, smoked it until it tasted like campfire, dried, pickled, and fermented anything they could get their hands on. The poor had to rely on local options, often working together to prepare and store food for the community. The rich? They had entire buildings dedicated to stockpiling grub granaries, ice houses, underground vaults. But no matter how fancy or broke you were, one thing was certain. If you didn't preserve it right, you were doomed by spring. Storage methods were serious business. On large estates or in religious sanctuaries, food was stacked, sealed, and guarded like gold. Think stone cellars with barrel-lined walls and crypt-like silence, except instead of skeletons, you had sacks of onions. This wasn't just survival, it was strategy. Now, staying warm with food is one thing, but staying warm in clothes? That was a different nightmare. Medieval winters weren't kind, and without radiators or Uniqlo, people had to dress smarter freeze. And no, fashion wasn't just for the rich. Layers were a necessity, not a choice. Every layer added was one more chance to keep your fingers from turning into icicles. Peasants had it the hardest. Their clothes were handmade at home, a brutal, time-consuming job usually done by the same people wearing them. They used whatever was nearby, mostly wool and linen. This meant your winter outfit depended heavily on geography. Live in a sheep-filled region? Great. Live somewhere with only mud and chickens? Tough luck. If they had a few extra coins, they might buy something from a local market. But most wore what they could craft, patch, or inherit. The nobles, on the other hand, went full runway. They had tailor-made winter wardrobes lined with fur and stitched with flair. Long cloaks, hooded tunics, fur-trimmed hats, everything screamed status while still being warm enough to survive a snowstorm. They didn't just wear it, they flaunted it. But everyone, regardless of class, followed the seasons with their clothes. Wool was king. Its natural ability to trap heat made it one of the most valuable materials of the age. Peasant tunics were basic but practical. And beneath all that, layers of underclothes, because nobody wanted a medieval breeze hitting bare skin in January. Underneath it all, peasants wore inner layers spun from rough linen, scratchy, stiff, and definitely not cozy. Over that came heavy cloaks or mantles, the medieval equivalent of wrapping yourself in a damp carpet. For footwear, leather was the go-to. The average villager wore turn shoes, leather stitched inside out, so the seams were hidden and your feet didn't look like stitched-up potatoes. Meanwhile, nobles strutted around in stylish options made from finer leather, some even decorated with embroidery because apparently even your toes needed to show off status. Linen underneath, wool on top, that was the formula. The colder it got, the more layers you piled on. But winter wasn't just about staying warm. It was about staying sane. Because when the farm work stopped and the snow kept falling, people needed something to do. In the peasant world, this meant gathering indoors, huddling by the fire, and getting busy with simple pleasures. No Netflix, no phones, just wood, wool, and conversation. Winter was prime time for fixing stuff, carving spoons, patching tools, spinning thread. Wood carving wasn't just a craft, it was survival disguised as entertainment. If it wasn't making utensils, it was reinforcing your house before the wind ripped it apart. For nobles, things got more theatrical. The castles turned into winter retreats. They filled the cold months with lavish indoor gatherings, music performances, and endless games of dice or board games made from hand-carved wood and way too much spare time. You'd have jesters juggling and musicians playing while everyone wore fur-lined robes and pretended the walls weren't leaking cold air. But if you wanted to leave your cold, miserable home, good luck. Traveling during medieval winter was a nightmare, like trying to cross Antarctica with no roads, no maps, and a horse that didn't want to be there. Most roads were little more than muddy tracks. In winter, they disappeared under snowdrifts or turned to slush and ice. What was a simple walk in summer became a frozen endurance test in January. Travel was slow, exhausting, and dangerous. Most people didn't bother unless it was absolutely necessary. But nobles, being nobles, sometimes relocated to other estates in search of less frozen misery or better food. They traveled in groups, with supplies, guards, and all the drama of a medieval road trip. Even with resources, it was still a slog. And through all of this, the cold, the hunger, the boredom, there was one thing that bound everyone together: religion. Winter didn't just test your body, it tested your soul. In an age of plagues and poverty, faith wasn't optional, it was how people made sense of their brutal world. It gave structure to the season, meaning to the suffering, and hope that spring might actually come. Hope wasn't just a feeling, it was a lifeline. During those endless, freezing months, the medieval calendar was ruled by the church. Religious rituals weren't just about worship, they gave people a reason to keep going. When days blurred into a gray, frozen mess, feast days acted like checkpoints. They broke the silence. They brought back music. They reminded people that spring would come, eventually. These celebrations weren't optional, they were necessary. They were the medieval version of a mental health day, only with more incense and less therapy. In noble manners, feast days meant full-on events music echoing through stone halls, mountains of roasted meat, and goblets of whatever could be fermented. For the peasants, things were simpler but just as important. Communal gatherings lit up the darkness, even if the only entertainment was a fiddle, a fire, and a cup of watered-down ale. These moments gave structure to a season that otherwise moved like a glacier. And while it might look like winter brought everything to a halt, it was far from lazy. The freezing cold didn't mean people stopped working, it just meant the work changed. When snow covered the fields and fingers couldn't grip a spade, life moved indoors. For peasants, it was the one time of year when they weren't breaking their backs in the fields. But that didn't mean they were relaxing. Far from it. Families switched gears now. It was all about catching up. Fixing tools, carving new handles, spinning wool, patching clothes-very item that needed repair was suddenly on the to-do list. Winter wasn't downtime, it was deadline season. All those jobs ignored during the harvest months came back with a vengeance. And everything had to be ready for the next cycle. Planting, farming, and surviving all over again. Preservation duties kicked into full gear too. You couldn't just dump grain in a corner and hope for the best. You had to inspect it, rotate it, keep rats away. Fermented foods needed attention. Materials for spring had to be prepared in advance. Because if you waited until the frost melted to get started, you were already behind. Everything was handmade, hand-fixed, and handled with care because there was no backup plan. If your clothes fell apart, you didn't get new ones you stitched until your fingers bled. If your tools broke, you carved new ones. It was exhausting, but it was survival. Winter was the catch-up sprint before the next storm of work arrived. And in the castles, the nobility had their own winter obligations. They weren't exactly roughing it, but they weren't lounging either. Their great halls became gathering spaces for politics, diplomacy, and power games disguised as banquets. They hosted fellow lords, bishops, wandering musicians, and anyone else worth impressing. Hospitality wasn't just kindness, it was influence. Meanwhile, in the towns, tradesmen kept the wheels turning. Tailors stitched by candlelight. Blacksmiths hammered in icy workshops. Shoemakers and weavers kept up production while snow buried the streets. Winter didn't stop them, it just made their job harder. So while the season was brutal, it never truly brought life to a stop. It just changed the pace, shifted the focus, and forced everyone peasant or noble to adapt or suffer. Medieval winter was a battle, and survival? That was the prize.